The rooftop glittered with champagne glasses, designer dresses, and the kind of smiles rich people practiced in mirrors. Brett Lawson stood at the center of it all, accepting congratulations for becoming senior vice president, while his hand rested possessively on Zelda Gilbert's waist like she was just another symbol of his success. Then his CEO handed Zelda the microphone, and Brett's face lost all color. Because standing in that ballroom wearing the same calm silver dress he told her was too simple, Zelda already knew about the affair. The lies, the stolen career, the woman across the room wearing the bracelet Brett claimed never existed. Zelda lifted the microphone slowly and smiled. "I want to thank my husband," she said softly, "for teaching me what betrayal sounds like behind closed doors. If you've ever stayed too long in a relationship that slowly destroyed your self-worth, this story will hit harder than you expect. And by the end, you might see yourself differently too." 10 years earlier, before the penthouse parties, before the designer suits and polished corporate smiles, Brett Lawson had been just another exhausted graduate student sitting alone in the corner of a crowded coffee shop in Boston. Zelda Gilbert remembered the exact moment she first noticed him. He looked frustrated, staring at a spreadsheet on his laptop, like it had personally betrayed him. His dark hair was messy, his sleeves rolled up unevenly, and there was something painfully human about the way he kept rubbing his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. She had smiled before she could stop herself. "You look like you're about 5 minutes away from throwing that computer through a window." Brett looked up startled. Then he laughed. And that laugh changed her life. Back then, Brett wasn't arrogant. He wasn't polished. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into rooms expecting people to admire him. He was insecure, hungry, desperate to prove himself. Zelda fell in love with that version of him. Not the man standing under crystal chandeliers years later pretending he built himself from nothing. The truth was far less glamorous. Zelda had been the one working 2 freelance branding jobs while Brett finished business school. She had been the one paying rent when his internship fell through. She had been the one staying awake until 2 in the morning, helping him practice presentations in their tiny apartment kitchen. And every single time Brett doubted himself, Zelda had been there. "You're smarter than all of them," she would whisper while adjusting his tie. "You just don't know it yet." At first, Brett appreciated her. God, he appreciated her. He used to kiss her forehead while she worked late on her design projects. One day he'd promise softly, "I'm going to give you the life you deserve." Zelda believed him. That was the tragedy of loving someone before they became successful. You keep waiting for the grateful version of them to come back. But sometimes success doesn't reveal character. Sometimes it replaces it. Years passed quickly after Brett landed his first consulting job in Chicago. Then came the promotions, the luxury condo, the expensive watches, the networking dinners, the endless pressure to look perfect. And slowly, almost invisibly, Zelda started disappearing inside her own marriage. At first, the sacrifices felt temporary. When Brett needed help preparing for client pitches, she postponed her own branding business launch. When he traveled constantly, she handled everything at home alone. When his mother Diane needed surgery, Zelda spent 6 exhausting weeks caring for her, while Brett attended conferences in New York and San Francisco. Diane never appreciated it. Not once. "You're a sweet girl," Diane would say in that cold upper-class tone she mastered over decades, but I always imagined Brett with someone more driven. Zelda used to smile politely and swallow the humiliation whole, because keeping peace had become second nature to her. By year 7 of their marriage, Zelda had stopped introducing herself as a designer altogether. Now she was simply Brett Lawson's wife, and somehow nobody noticed how much of her vanished to make his life easier. Not even Brett. Especially not Brett. One snowy December evening, Zelda stood alone in their kitchen decorating sugar cookies for a corporate holiday party Brett insisted she host. The entire condo smelled like cinnamon and vanilla. Her phone buzzed, a message from Brett. "Running late again. Don't wait up." Zelda stared at the text for a long moment. 3 years earlier, that message would have hurt her feelings. Now it just made her tired. The loneliness inside their marriage had become strangely routine. Brett still kissed her goodbye, still bought expensive gifts on birthdays, still posted anniversary photos online with captions about his incredible wife. But emotionally, he had started treating her like background furniture in his carefully curated life. Useful, comforting, invisible. And the worst part was how gradually it happened. No screaming fights, no dramatic collapse, just thousands of tiny moments where Zelda learned her needs mattered less than Brett's ambitions. "Can we spend one weekend together without your phone?" she asked once quietly during dinner. Brett sighed immediately. "Zelda, This is how executive life works. Another time, she tried showing him new logo concepts she designed after months of creative burnout. He barely glanced at the screen. Looks nice, babe. Looks nice. That was all. She remembered staring at him across the dining table, thinking something terrifying. If I disappeared tomorrow, would he even notice emotionally or just practically? Still, Zelda stayed. Because love makes intelligent women negotiate against themselves. She kept telling herself Brett was stressed. That success changed people temporarily. That marriage required patience. And deep down, Zelda missed the man from the coffee shop. The man who used to look at her like she mattered more than the room. Then, one night, everything shifted. It happened after another corporate fundraiser downtown. Brett came home after midnight, smelling faintly of expensive perfume and whiskey. He tossed his coat carelessly across the couch before heading into the shower. Zelda cleaned up automatically behind him out of habit. Then something small slipped from his coat pocket onto the floor. A receipt. She almost ignored it, but the total caught her attention first. $14,230. Her stomach tightened instantly. Slowly, Zelda unfolded the paper. Cartier. Women's diamond bracelet. Purchased 3 days earlier. Her heartbeat started thudding hard against her ribs. Brett hadn't bought her jewelry in over 2 years. Not because they couldn't afford it. Because, according to him, luxury gifts were financially irresponsible. Zelda stared at the receipt so long, the numbers started blurring. Maybe it was for a client. Maybe for his mother. Maybe. Then she remembered something else. Earlier that week, Brett had forgotten their anniversary entirely. Not just the dinner reservation, the entire day. Zelda suddenly felt cold all over. From the bathroom, she heard Brett humming casually under the shower water. Completely relaxed. Completely normal, like he wasn't quietly destroying her life one lie at a time. Zelda folded the receipt carefully with trembling fingers. For the first time in years, something inside her stopped making excuses for him, and somewhere deep beneath the heartbreak, something dangerous began waking up. Zelda didn't confront Brett after finding the Cartier receipt. That surprised even her. A younger version of herself would have walked straight into the bathroom, holding the paper and shaking hands, desperate for reassurance. Desperate to hear a comforting explanation. Desperate to believe she was still loved. But something had changed the moment she unfolded that receipt. For the first time in years, Zelda stopped reacting emotionally and started observing, which she would later realize terrified Brett far more. The next morning, she watched him differently across the kitchen island while pouring coffee. Brett scrolled through emails on his phone, barely looking at her. "You okay?" he asked casually. The irony almost made her laugh. She nodded. "Just tired." "Mm-hmm." That was it. No concern, no curiosity, no real eye contact. He kissed the top of her head absently before leaving for work, smelling like expensive cologne and ambition. Zelda stood alone in the silent condo after the door shut. Then she whispered softly to herself, "Who are you becoming?" But deep down, she already knew the answer. Brett Lawson had become the kind of man who believed success excused cruelty, and the scariest part, he genuinely thought he deserved it. Over the next few weeks, Zelda noticed everything. Once you stop lying to yourself, patterns become impossible to ignore. Brett suddenly guarded his phone like classified government property. He started angling the screen away whenever she walked near him. His passwords changed. Late-night client strategy sessions became almost nightly occurrences. And somehow, every conversation between them turned transactional. "Can you RSVP to the Whitman dinner? Did you send my dry cleaning? Where's my navy tie?" Their marriage no longer sounded like love. It sounded like management. One Friday evening, Brett announced they needed to attend a charity gala hosted by his company downtown. "It's important," he said while adjusting his cufflinks. "Senior leadership will be there." Zelda stared at herself in the mirror while getting ready later that night. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Her dark hair fell softly over one shoulder. Her emerald dress fit perfectly. Her makeup was elegant and understated. She still looked beautiful. So why had Brett spent years making her feel invisible? The thought stayed with her the entire drive into the city. The gala took place inside a historic Chicago hotel, dripping in gold light and old money elegance. Crystal chandeliers reflected against marble floors while a string quartet played near the ballroom entrance. Women in designer gowns floated through the room beside powerful men discussing investments and acquisitions over champagne. Brett transformed instantly in environments like this. He smiled bigger, spoke smoother, touched Zelda's lower back possessively whenever important executives walked by, like she was part of the image he curated, not a person, a symbol. Brett, a feminine voice, cut through the crowd. Zelda turned, and for the first time she saw Victoria Pierce. The woman was stunning in a sharp, effortless kind of way. Tall, blonde, impossibly polished. The kind of woman magazines described as magnetic, but it wasn't Victoria's beauty that made Zelda's stomach tighten. It was the look Victoria gave Brett. Too familiar, too intimate, like she already belonged to him. "There you are," Victoria said warmly, touching Brett's arm. Brett smiled differently at her. That was the first thing Zelda noticed. The smile reached his eyes. "Victoria," Brett said quickly, "this is my wife Zelda." Victoria turned gracefully. "Oh my God," she said smoothly. "I've heard so much about you." Zelda forced a polite smile. "Hopefully good things." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Well, Brett says you're incredibly supportive." Supportive. Not talented, not intelligent, not creative. Supportive. Like a silent assistant. Something sharp twisted inside Zelda's chest. Then she saw it. The bracelet. A diamond Cartier bracelet glittering against Victoria's wrist beneath the ballroom lights. The exact bracelet from the receipt. For one terrifying second, Zelda forgot how to breathe. Brett noticed where she was looking immediately, and panic flashed across his face. Tiny, fast. But there. Victoria glanced down innocently. "Oh, this old thing," Zelda looked at Brett slowly. He recovered almost instantly. It was a corporate gift, he said too quickly. "For landing the Morgan account." Lie. Zelda knew it immediately. Not because of the words, because Brett suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. Victoria smiled softly while sipping champagne. "You're lucky," she told Zelda. "Men like Brett don't come around often." The comment sounded harmless, but Zelda heard the subtext underneath it. "I know exactly what I have access to." Throughout the night, the tension grew unbearable. Victoria stayed near Brett constantly, laughing too hard at his jokes, touching his arm casually, standing just slightly too close, and Brett never once created distance. Not once. Meanwhile, Zelda felt herself slowly disappearing inside the ballroom noise. At one point, she overheard two women whispering near the bar. "That's Victoria Pierce, right? She and Brett Lawson definitely have something going on. You think the wife knows." Zelda walked away before hearing the answer. In the bathroom, she locked herself inside a marble stall and pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. She felt humiliated. Not because Brett might be cheating, because everyone else seemed to know before she did. That was the part destroying her. The public embarrassment, the possibility that she'd become one of those wealthy corporate wives people quietly pitied behind closed doors. When she finally returned to the ballroom, Brett looked irritated. "Where were you? I needed air." "You disappeared during an important conversation." Important conversation. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "You seem upset." Zelda stared at him for a long moment, and suddenly saw the imbalance in their marriage with horrifying clarity. She'd spent years emotionally protecting a man who no longer emotionally protected her at all. On the drive home, silence filled the car heavily. Chicago lights blurred past the windows like streaks of cold gold. Finally, Zelda spoke quietly. "Are you sleeping with Victoria Brett?" Let out a sharp laugh immediately. "Jesus Christ, that's not an answer." "You're being paranoid." "There was a Cartier receipt in your coat." Brett's jaw tightened. "For a corporate gift." "You forgot our anniversary 3 days before buying another woman a $14,000 bracelet." His expression hardened instantly. "You know what your problem is lately." Zelda blinked slowly. "My problem. You sit at home too much and overthink everything." The cruelty of it stunned her silent. Not because it was loud, because it was calculated. Brett knew exactly where her insecurities lived now, and he weaponized them effortlessly. When they got home, he headed straight for the shower again. Same routine, same distance. But this time, Zelda noticed something else. His phone vibrating repeatedly on the bathroom counter. A message notification lit up the screen. "Victoria." Zelda froze. Then another message appeared. "After your promotion, we won't have to hide anymore." Her entire body went cold. The world suddenly felt eerily quiet. The shower water ran behind the bathroom door while steam filled the room. Brett had no idea she was standing there reading the truth glowing across his screen. For a second, Zelda thought she might collapse. 10 years. 10 years of loyalty, sacrifice, love, reduced to a secret inconvenience standing between Brett and the woman he actually wanted. Her hands trembled violently as she picked up the phone. Then slowly, carefully, Zelda took a screenshot and sent it to herself. Not out of revenge, not yet, but because something inside her finally understood a painful truth. If she didn't start protecting herself, nobody else would. 3 nights later, Brett told Zelda they were hosting a dinner party. Not asked, told. "We need to keep strengthening relationships before the promotion announcement," he said, while scrolling through emails at the kitchen counter. "Some senior people are coming." Zelda folded laundry quietly without looking up. "Okay." Brett glanced at her briefly, almost suspicious of her calmness. Normally, she would have asked questions, suggested menus, tried to make the evening perfect. This time, she simply nodded, and somehow that unsettled him more. "The reservation list is on the island," he added. "Victoria's coming too." The shirt in Zelda's hands paused for half a second, only half. Then she continued folding carefully. "All right." Brett frowned slightly. No emotional reaction, no jealousy, no tears. For the first time since the affair started, Zelda realized something important. Brett actually enjoyed watching her hurt. That realization disgusted her more than the cheating itself. The dinner took place on a cold Saturday evening in late October. Their downtown Chicago condo looked like something out of an architecture magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline, while soft jazz played through hidden speakers. Candles flickered across the marble dining table Zelda spent 3 hours decorating alone. She cooked everything herself. Braised short ribs, truffle mashed potatoes, roasted asparagus, dark chocolate soufflé. Not because Brett deserved it, but because Zelda refused to let pain ruin who she was. Still as she adjusted wine glasses beneath warm golden lighting, a quiet bitterness settled inside her chest. For years, she had mistaken self-sacrifice for love. At exactly 7:30, the guests arrived. Corporate executives, their polished wives, loud laughter, expensive perfume, fake intimacy. Brett transformed instantly into the charming version of himself the world adored. He greeted people warmly, hand resting lightly against Zelda's waist like they were still deeply in love. Performance mode. Zelda almost admired how naturally he lied. Then Victoria arrived, and suddenly the entire room shifted. She stepped inside wearing a fitted black dress that turned heads immediately. Elegant, sophisticated, dangerous. Victoria smiled when she saw Zelda, not warmly, triumphantly. "Zelda," she said smoothly, "your home is stunning." "Thank you." Victoria slowly scanned the condo again. "You have incredible taste." The comment should have sounded complimentary. Instead, it felt invasive, like another woman admiring a life she intended to steal. Brett appeared beside Victoria almost instantly. "You made it," he said, smiling wider than he had all week. Zelda noticed everything now, the softness in his voice, the unconscious eye contact, the subtle energy between them. Once you see betrayal clearly, you can never unsee it again. Throughout dinner, Victoria positioned herself expertly beside Brett whenever possible. She laughed at his stories before the punchlines finished, touched his arm casually during conversations, finished his thoughts. It was intimate in a way only people already emotionally involved understood. And worst of all, Brett liked showing her off. At one point, during appetizers, a senior executive complimented Zelda's cooking. "This is incredible," he said. "Brett, your wife's talented." Before Brett could answer, Victoria smiled lightly over her wine glass. "Some women are naturally domestic," she said. "I honestly envy that. I could never stay home full-time without losing my mind." A few people chuckled awkwardly. Zelda felt the insult land immediately. So did everyone else. Brett could have defended her, could have said Zelda used to run successful design projects, could have acknowledged her creativity, could have shown basic loyalty. Instead, he smirked. "Zelda definitely keeps a life organized," he said. Organized. Like a personal assistant. Not a woman, not his partner. Just support staff for his success. Something cold settled deeper inside Zelda's chest. Across the table, Brett Lawson dabbed her lips delicately with a napkin. "Well," Diane added casually, "not everyone is built for high-pressure careers." There it was. The familiar humiliation, served elegantly with expensive wine. Zelda looked around the table slowly. Nobody defended her. Nobody. Not even the women. Especially not the women. Because in rooms like these, people only respected power. And Zelda had spent years making herself smaller to protect Brett's ego. Now everyone mistook her kindness for weakness. Victoria leaned slightly closer to Brett. "You're lucky," she said softly enough for Zelda to hear. "Most executives lose their marriages climbing this high." Brett laughed under his breath. The sound physically hurt Zelda, not because it was cruel, because it was intimate. Suddenly she understood something devastating. The affair wasn't just physical. Victoria had access to the version of Brett Zelda used to know. The ambitious version. The energized version. The emotionally engaged version. Meanwhile, Zelda got whatever remained after the performance ended. Later that evening, while clearing dessert plates alone in the kitchen, Zelda heard voices near the hallway. Brett and Victoria, low, private. She froze instinctively. "You need to be patient," Brett murmured. "I'm tired of hiding." "You think this is easy for me," Victoria laughed softly. "Oh, please. Your wife practically worships you. She'd forgive anything." The words punched the air from Zelda's lungs. Not because Victoria said them, because Brett didn't disagree. Silence followed. Then Victoria spoke again. "You deserve someone who actually matches your future." A long pause. Then Brett answered quietly, "I know." Zelda stopped breathing entirely. For 10 years she had built her life around this man. Protected him, loved him, defended him, and somewhere along the way Brett Lawson had started seeing her as dead weight. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm, too suffocating. She gripped the marble countertop hard enough her knuckles whitened. The terrifying part wasn't the betrayal anymore. It was realizing how long Brett had emotionally abandoned her before she noticed. When the guests finally began leaving hours later, Zelda stood near the front door thanking them politely, while exhaustion hollowed her from the inside out. Victoria was the last to leave. Of course she was. She stepped close enough for Zelda to smell expensive jasmine perfume. Then she smiled. Not kindly. Victorious. "Tonight was lovely," Victoria said softly. Zelda forced herself to hold eye contact. "I'm glad you enjoyed it." Victoria tilted her head slightly. For a moment, her polished corporate mask slipped, and underneath it was something ugly. Contempt. "You know," Victoria said quietly, "some women are chapters." Zelda stayed silent. Victoria's lips curved faintly. "And some women," she whispered, "are the upgrade." Then she walked away. The elevator doors closed, and silence flooded the condo. For several seconds, Zelda stood frozen by the entrance. Then Brett appeared behind her, loosening his tie casually, like nothing catastrophic had happened. "You okay?" he asked distractedly. Zelda turned slowly, and for the first time in their marriage, she truly looked at him. Not the man she fell in love with, not the struggling student from Boston, not the husband she sacrificed herself for, but the man standing in front of her now, arrogant, emotionally careless, completely convinced she would never leave. Brett noticed something in her expression shift, what he asked cautiously. Zelda smiled faintly, a strange, calm smile that made something flicker across Brett's face. Unease. Nothing she said softly. But deep inside, something irreversible had already begun. Because heartbreak can destroy a woman, or it can introduce her to the version of herself that no longer tolerates disrespect. And Zelda was dangerously close to meeting her. The confrontation finally happened on a rainy Tuesday night. Not because Zelda planned it, because eventually betrayal fills every room until silence becomes unbearable. Brett came home close to midnight carrying the sharp smell of whiskey, expensive cologne, and cold November air. He loosened his tie while walking through the condo like he owned every molecule inside it, which in his mind he probably did. Zelda sat alone at the dining table in soft lamplight waiting. No television, no music, just silence. Brett paused when he saw her. Something in her stillness immediately put him on edge. "You're awake?" "Yes." He tossed his keys onto the marble counter. Long day. Zelda studied him carefully. For years she would have rushed to make him comfortable first. Warmed up dinner, asked about work, smoothed over his stress before addressing her pain. Not tonight. "I know about you and Victoria," she said quietly. The words landed between them like shattered glass. Brett froze for half a second. Then came the performance. "What are you talking about?" Zelda almost admired how automatic the lie was. She reached into her sweater pocket and placed the folded Cartier receipt on the table. Then the screenshot. Victoria's message glowed coldly beneath the dining room light. After your promotion, we won't have to hide anymore." For several seconds, Brett stared at the evidence silently. Then he exhaled sharply and rubbed his jaw. Jesus Christ, Zelda. Not guilt. Annoyance. Like she had inconvenienced him emotionally. "That's what you say?" Zelda asked softly. Brett pulled out a chair aggressively and sat down across from her. "You went through my phone." I looked at a message that appeared in front of me. "That's still an invasion of privacy?" Zelda blinked slowly. The audacity almost made her laugh. "You're cheating on me. We're coworkers. You bought her a $14,000 bracelet. It was strategic." Strategic. In corporate environments, relationships matter. The gaslighting was so immediate, so absurd, Zelda actually felt herself disconnect emotionally for a moment. Brett leaned back in his chair, frustrated now. "You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I?" "Yes." His voice sharpened. "Do you have any idea how much pressure I'm under right now?" There it was. The shift. Suddenly she wasn't a hurt wife. She was an obstacle to his stress. Zelda stared at the man she once adored and realized something horrifying. Brett genuinely believed his ambition justified everything. "I supported you through every stage of your career," she said quietly. "Every single one. And I appreciated that." Past tense. Zelda noticed immediately. Apparently so did Brett, because his expression flickered slightly afterward. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. "You knew what executive life would require." "No," Zelda said softly. "I knew what marriage was supposed to require." Brett laughed bitterly and stood again. "God, you always do this. Do what you make everything emotional." The sentence cut deeper than yelling would have, because it revealed exactly how little respect he still had for her humanity. Zelda's voice stayed calm. "I gave up my career for this marriage. Nobody forced you to." That one almost broke her, not because it was loud, because it was cruelly true in a technical sense. No, Brett hadn't forced her. He had simply benefited from her sacrifices, while quietly encouraging them until she disappeared inside his life completely. "You used to say we were a team," Zelda whispered. "We are." "No. Teams don't humiliate each other." Brett sighed heavily, like she was exhausting him. "You know what your problem is?" Zelda looked up slowly. "You stopped growing." The room went silent. Rain tapped softly against the giant windows overlooking Chicago. Brett continued before she could respond. "You got comfortable. You stopped pushing yourself. You stopped being interesting." Every word landed with surgical precision, because Brett knew exactly where her insecurities lived now. "You sit at home obsessing over feelings while I'm out building an actual future for us." Zelda felt tears burn her eyes instantly. Not because she believed him anymore, because part of her still remembered the woman she used to be before she abandoned herself to love him. And Brett knew that too. "You think Victoria understands pressure?" he continued. "She's ambitious, driven. She gets what this world actually demands." Zelda stared at him in disbelief. "You mean she feeds your ego?" Brett's jaw tightened. At least she still has one. The cruelty of the comment hung heavily between them. Years earlier, Zelda might have collapsed crying, might have begged him to choose her, might have apologized for becoming smaller while carrying both their emotional lives alone. But tonight something different happened, very quietly. Something inside her snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cleanly, like a rope pulled too tight for too long, finally breaking in silence. Zelda stood slowly from the table. Brett kept talking, pacing now. "You have no idea what it takes to survive at my level." "No," Zelda interrupted softly. "I do." He stopped. For the first time all night he truly looked at her, and suddenly something unfamiliar crossed his face. Uncertainty. Zelda walked toward the kitchen counter calmly and picked up her phone. Brett frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" She looked at him steadily. "Protecting myself." His expression darkened instantly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Zelda didn't answer, because she had already started recording the conversation 20 minutes earlier. Every lie, every insult, every admission. Brett took a step closer. "Are you seriously trying to turn this into some kind of drama?" The word almost fascinated her. Men like Brett always called women emotional after emotionally destroying them. It was how they avoided accountability. "You cheated on me," Zelda said quietly, "and somehow you still found a way to blame me for it." Brett's patience finally cracked. "Because you made this marriage suffocating." The volume startled even him. But once the anger started, it poured out fast. You stopped taking care of yourself emotionally." Zelda stared at him. Emotionally, she had spent 10 years managing his emotions like a second full-time job. "I carried everything," she whispered. "No," Brett snapped. "You hid behind me." The sentence sliced through the room brutally. Then came the worst part. Brett looked directly at her and said coldly, "You would not survive without me." Silence. Pure silence. The kind that changes people permanently. Zelda felt her entire body go numb. Not because she believed him, because she suddenly realized he believed it. After everything she sacrificed, after everything she built beside him, Brett Lawson truly thought she was powerless without his name attached to hers. The arrogance of it was almost unbelievable. "You really think I'm nothing without you?" she asked quietly. Brett rubbed his forehead impatiently. "I think you've built your entire life around being my wife." The truth hurt because part of it was real, but reality sounded different now. Less like shame, more like warning. Zelda swallowed hard and nodded slowly. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not warmly, not sadly, just knowingly. And Brett noticed immediately. His expression shifted. "What's that look for?" Zelda picked up her wine glass carefully. "You know," she said softly, "I spent years thinking love meant loyalty." Brett frowned. "But loyalty without respect," Zelda continued quietly, "is just emotional slavery." Something dangerous flickered across Brett's face then. Because for the first time in years, Zelda was no longer begging to be chosen, and men like Brett panic when the woman they control emotionally stops chasing their approval. His voice hardened instantly. "You're still coming to my promotion party next week." Zelda said nothing. Brett stepped closer. "And you're going to smile beside me like nothing's wrong." Her silence irritated him further. "Do you understand me?" Finally, Zelda looked up. Their eyes locked across the dim kitchen light. Then Brett delivered the sentence that destroyed whatever remained of their marriage. "You embarrass me publicly," he said coldly, "and I'll make sure losing me becomes the biggest mistake of your life." For several seconds, neither of them moved. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Chicago glittered below them like another universe entirely. And deep inside herself, Zelda realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid anymore. The morning after the confrontation, Brett acted like nothing had happened. That disturbed Zelda more than the fight itself. He came into the kitchen wearing a navy suit, checking emails while drinking espresso from the expensive Italian machine Zelda picked out years earlier. No apology, no shame, no acknowledgement, just silence wrapped in arrogance. "You'll need to confirm the catering numbers for Thursday," Brett said casually. The promotion team added more guests. Zelda stared at him across the kitchen island. "How are you functioning normally right now?" Brett finally looked up, and for a split second she saw irritation flash through his face. Not guilt. Irritation. "Because unlike you," he said calmly, "I know how to compartmentalize." The sentence sat heavily in the room. Compartmentalize. That was exactly what Brett had done to her. One compartment for ambition, one compartment for image, one compartment for the mistress. And somewhere in the background, a compartment labeled wife, useful when needed, invisible when inconvenient. Brett grabbed his car keys. "We'll talk later when emotions settle down." Then he walked out, like he hadn't just detonated 10 years of marriage. The second the door closed, Zelda collapsed into a chair. Not crying, not screaming, just exhausted. Her entire nervous system felt hollowed out. For days she moved through the condo like a ghost, sleeping poorly, eating barely enough to function, smiling automatically whenever Brett was around because she no longer had energy for war. But underneath the numbness, something else had started growing. Clarity. Pain has a strange way of sharpening intelligence once denial dies. On Thursday afternoon, Zelda found herself standing inside their walk-in office, searching for old tax documents Brett needed for the promotion review process. The office had once been hers too. Years ago, she used the space for branding projects and client presentations before Brett's career slowly consumed every corner of their life. Now the room mostly contained his achievements, awards, framed magazine features, corporate photos, proof of importance. Zelda opened a lower filing cabinet absently, then paused. A familiar logo stared back at her from an old presentation folder. Her stomach tightened instantly. She pulled the file out carefully. Inside were branding drafts she created nearly 8 years earlier, luxury hospitality concepts, visual strategy frameworks, Tagline architecture. Zelda remembered these projects vividly because she had stayed awake for weeks building them during Brett's first major consulting opportunity. Back then, he asked for a little creative feedback. She ended up doing almost everything. At the time, it felt normal. That's what supportive wives did. Right. Zelda sat down slowly at the desk and began flipping through the documents. Then her heartbeat started accelerating. Because some pages looked wrong. Her original concepts were there, but Brett's company branding templates had been layered over them. His name appeared on presentation credits, not hers. Zelda frowned and opened another folder. Then another. Then another. Each discovery hit harder than the last. Entire strategy models, visual campaign structures, client psychology maps, all hers, every single one repackaged under Brett Lawson's corporate identity. The room suddenly felt too small. Too hot. "Oh my God," Zelda whispered. Her hands trembled as she reached for an old external hard drive in the drawer. She plugged it into her laptop. Folders loaded slowly onto the screen. Time-stamped years earlier. Original drafts. Original files. Original authorship. Proof. Undeniable proof. Zelda stared at the glowing screen while memories flooded back violently. Brett sitting beside her late at night saying, "You're brilliant at this stuff. You think visually in ways I can't. We're a team." A team. The word made her physically sick now, because suddenly she understood something horrifying. Brett hadn't just stolen her emotional labor. He had stolen her intellectual labor too, and she had handed it to him willingly because she trusted him. The realization cracked something deep inside her chest. All those years she thought she was supporting his career. She had actually been helping build it, without recognition, without credit, without protection. Zelda pressed shaking fingers against her mouth. Then another memory surfaced. 3 years earlier, Brett received a massive promotion after leading a luxury hospitality rebranding project that impressed senior executives nationwide. He called it the turning point of his career. Zelda remembered congratulating him through tears because she was proud. Now she realized why some parts of that campaign always felt strangely familiar, because she created them. A sound escaped her throat somewhere between heartbreak and disbelief. How long had he been doing this? How many pieces of her did he quietly absorb into himself while convincing her she was becoming less valuable? The office door suddenly opened. Zelda jumped. Brett walked in, loosening his tie. "What are you doing?" Then he saw the folders, and everything changed. For the first time since this nightmare began, Brett actually looked nervous, real nervous. Zelda stood slowly. "These are my designs." Brett recovered quickly. They were collaborative concepts. "No," Zelda said quietly. "They were mine." He exhaled sharply and rubbed his forehead. "Zelda, not this again. Not this again." Like theft was an inconvenience. You submitted these under your name. They were adapted for corporate use. You stole them. Brett's expression hardened immediately. "That's a very dramatic interpretation." Dramatic. Again. Every truth she spoke became drama the second it threatened him. Zelda stared at him in disbelief. "I built part of your career. You supported my career." "No," she whispered. "I built it." The room went silent. And suddenly Brett looked angry, not ashamed, angry. Because narcissistic people don't panic when they hurt you. They panic when they lose ownership of the narrative. "You're acting like I manipulated you," he snapped. "You did." "I gave us this life." Zelda laughed softly then. A broken, exhausted laugh. "Our life." She gestured around the office. "This office used to be mine too." Brett crossed his arms defensively. "You stopped pursuing design because I was helping you survive. I never asked you to quit. You never stopped me either." That hit something. Brett's jaw tightened hard, because deep down he knew exactly how much Zelda sacrificed. He just stopped respecting the cost. Zelda turned back toward the laptop screen. Her old files glowed back at her like messages from a former self she abandoned years ago. She barely recognized that woman anymore. Creative, ambitious, alive. Tears finally blurred her vision, not because Brett cheated, not even because he stole from her, but because she suddenly realized how completely she had disappeared trying to help him become someone important. And the worst part, Brett still believed he was the victim here. "This is insane timing," he muttered. "Do you realize what's happening next week?" Zelda looked at him slowly. "My promotion." There it was again. Always him. Always his future, his stress, his reputation, his success. Even now, standing inside the ruins of their marriage, Brett's greatest concern was still his career. Something inside Zelda finally hardened completely. "You know what's insane?" she said quietly. Brett frowned. "That I spent 10 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger." He opened his mouth to argue, but she kept going. "I defended you to everyone. Your mother, your coworkers, myself." Her voice trembled now. "And the entire time you were taking pieces of me and presenting them as your own." Brett stepped closer. "Zelda. No." The word stopped him cold. It wasn't loud, but it carried something unfamiliar now. Strength. Zelda wiped her tears slowly. Then she looked directly at the man she once thought she'd grow old beside. And for the first time, she no longer saw power when she looked at him. She saw hunger, insecurity, fragile ego wrapped in expensive suits. Brett Lawson didn't become successful because he believed in himself. He became successful because women like Zelda carried him emotionally until he could stand tall enough to abandon them. The realization made her furious, but strangely, it also made her free. Then she noticed another folder partially hidden beneath Brett's desk drawer. Private banking statements. Zelda pulled them out slowly. Brett moved instantly. "Don't touch that. Too late." She already saw the account transfers, large amounts, repeated monthly, and attached to one name, Victoria Pierce. Zelda looked up slowly. Brett's face lost color, and suddenly the affair became far uglier than heartbreak. Because now she understood Brett wasn't just betraying her emotionally, he was preparing to replace her financially too. Rebecca Sterling's office sat on the 32nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan. Clean lines, muted colors, quiet power, the kind of place built by people who understood control. Zelda almost turned around twice before stepping inside. Not because she doubted Brett anymore, because walking into a divorce attorney's office meant admitting something terrifying out loud. Her marriage might already be dead. A young receptionist smiled politely. "Mrs. Lawson." Zelda hesitated slightly at the name. For the first time, it sounded foreign. "Zelda Gilbert," she corrected softly. The receptionist nodded without judgment. "Ms. Sterling is ready for you." That tiny moment nearly broke her. Not because it was dramatic, because it reminded her she still existed outside of Brett. Rebecca Sterling looked nothing like the cold, aggressive lawyer stereotype Zelda expected. She was elegant in a restrained way. Early 50s, sharp navy suit, silver-streaked dark hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders, calm eyes that looked like they had seen every version of heartbreak money could create. Rebecca stood as Zelda entered, Ms. Gilbert. Her voice carried warmth without softness. Zelda shook her hand carefully. "Thank you for seeing me." Rebecca gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Most women wait too long before scheduling this meeting." The sentence hit uncomfortably close to home. Zelda sat down slowly, clutching her leather folder tightly against her lap. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Chicago's skyline shimmered through the massive windows behind Rebecca, like another world entirely. Finally, Rebecca leaned forward slightly. "Tell me what happened." And somehow, that simple question unraveled Zelda faster than cruelty ever had, because nobody had asked her what happened in a very long time. Not really. People asked how Brett was, how his career was going, how the marriage looked. But nobody asked what it cost her to hold everything together. At first, Zelda spoke cautiously. The affair, the bracelet, the lies. Then the words started pouring out faster. Years of emotional neglect, the stolen creative work, the financial transfers, the manipulation, the way Brett slowly convinced her that shrinking herself was maturity. Rebecca listened without interrupting once. No fake sympathy. No dramatic reactions, just attention. Actual attention. By the time Zelda finished speaking, her throat hurt. Rebecca sat back quietly. Then she asked the question Zelda feared most. "Do you want to save the marriage?" The silence afterward felt enormous, because Zelda realized she no longer knew the answer. Or maybe she did, and was afraid to say it. "I think—" Zelda swallowed hard. "I think I spent years trying to save something that stopped existing a long time ago." Rebecca nodded slowly. "That usually means you already know." Tears burned Zelda's eyes instantly. Rebecca slid a tissue box across the desk gently. "Can I tell you something difficult?" she asked. Zelda nodded. Emotionally manipulative men rarely leave marriages suddenly. Rebecca's tone stayed calm. They slowly repositioned their wives emotionally until the wives stopped trusting themselves. Zelda stared at her. That's exactly what happened. I know. 3 simple words, but Zelda felt them deep in her chest. For weeks, Brett made her feel irrational, paranoid, emotional, small. And now this stranger understood the pattern within an hour. Rebecca opened a legal pad calmly. Let's talk facts. The conversation shifted quickly. Financial accounts, asset ownership, tax filings, corporate timelines. The more details Zelda provided, the more Rebecca's expression sharpened. Finally, Rebecca looked up. He transferred marital funds into a separate account connected to another woman. Yes. Without disclosure? Yes. Rebecca leaned back slowly. That's a problem. For the first time in weeks, Zelda felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because her marriage was collapsing, because reality was finally being acknowledged. Brett wasn't simply stressed. He wasn't confused. He wasn't accidentally distant. He was making calculated choices. And Rebecca saw it clearly. Do you have copies of the transfers? Zelda nodded and handed over printed statements. Rebecca reviewed them carefully. Then the branding files, then the screenshots, then the recording from the confrontation. The room grew quieter with every piece of evidence. Finally, Rebecca removed her glasses slowly. Your husband's very confident. Zelda laughed bitterly. You noticed that too. Men who underestimate their wives usually are. That sentence settled deeply inside Zelda, because for the first time someone wasn't treating her like collateral damage. Rebecca was treating her like someone with leverage. Here's what concerns me most, Rebecca continued. Your husband believes image protects him from consequences. Zelda looked down. That sounds exactly like Brett. Rebecca folded her hands carefully, which means if he feels publicly threatened, he may become aggressive emotionally, possibly financially. A chill moved through Zelda's body. He already threatened me. Rebecca's eyes sharpened instantly. What kind of threat? Zelda repeated Brett's words quietly. You embarrass me publicly, and I'll make sure losing me becomes the biggest mistake of your life. The office fell silent. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but something colder entered her voice afterward. Did he know you recorded that conversation? No. Good. Rebecca stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. Ms. Gilbert, she said carefully, your husband has spent years constructing an identity built on power. Zelda nodded slowly. And men like that rarely panic over morality. Rebecca turned toward her. They panic over exposure. Something clicked inside Zelda instantly, because suddenly she understood why Brett feared public embarrassment more than losing her. His entire self-worth depended on admiration. Without it, there was nothing underneath. Rebecca returned to her desk. Right now, Brett thinks you're emotionally broken. Her eyes locked onto Zelda's. That is your advantage. The sentence startled her. Advantage. Yes. Zelda sat quietly. For years she approached conflict emotionally while Brett approached it strategically. That imbalance nearly destroyed her. But now she was learning. Rebecca pulled a blank folder from her drawer. From this moment forward, you document everything. Every text, every transfer, every interaction. No emotional confrontations without preparation. No threats, no dramatic scenes. Zelda listened carefully. You need to become calm, Rebecca said. Not because you're weak, because calm women are dangerous to manipulative men. Dangerous. The word echoed strangely inside Zelda's chest. She had spent so many years trying not to intimidate Brett, trying not to outshine him, trying not to appear too much. And where did it leave her? Betrayed, erased, exhausted. Rebecca continued outlining legal strategy while Zelda took notes carefully. Private bank account, independent credit, secure copies of evidence, review shared assets quietly. Every instruction made Zelda feel slightly steadier, like she was slowly rebuilding bones beneath emotional collapse. Then Rebecca paused. There's one more thing. Zelda looked up. Do not confront the other woman. That surprised her. Why? Because Victoria Pierce isn't the real problem. Rebecca's voice sharpened slightly. Your husband created the conditions for betrayal. Don't let him reduce this story into women fighting over him. The truth of that hit hard. Because deep down, Zelda already knew Victoria was cruel, but Brett was the one who vowed loyalty. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, and one more piece of advice. Zelda waited quietly. Do not interrupt a man while he's building the stage for his own downfall. The sentence sent chills down Zelda's spine, not because it sounded dramatic, because instinctively, she knew Rebecca was right. Brett Lawson still believed he controlled the story, still believed Zelda was too emotionally dependent to leave, still believed power belonged exclusively to him, and for the first time in 10 years, Zelda stopped wanting to prove her worth to him. Instead, she started wondering something far more dangerous. What would happen when Brett realized she no longer needed his permission to survive? As Zelda left the office later that afternoon, cold winds swept through downtown Chicago. People rushed past in expensive coats beneath gray skies. The city looked exactly the same, but inside herself something fundamental had shifted. She arrived at Rebecca Sterling's office feeling abandoned. She left feeling armed and somewhere far above the city skyline. The stage for Brett Lawson's downfall had already begun. The week before, Brett's promotion gala felt strangely theatrical. Like everyone around Zelda was rehearsing for a performance except her. Brett moved through the condo with renewed confidence, completely unaware that the woman quietly making his coffee each morning had already started planning her escape. Or maybe not escape. Reclamation. There was a difference. The first thing Zelda did after meeting Rebecca Sterling was open a private bank account under her maiden name, Zelda Gilbert. Typing the name into official paperwork felt oddly emotional, like uncovering someone buried alive years ago. The banker smiled politely while reviewing documents. Starting something new, she asked casually. Zelda hesitated, then answered honestly, yes. And for the first time in months, the word didn't terrify her. It steadied her. Over the next several days, Zelda became meticulous. Every text Brett sent, every suspicious expense, every hidden transfer. Documented, stored, protected. At night, while Brett slept beside her like nothing was collapsing, Zelda sat quietly in the living room, organizing evidence beneath dim lamplight. The irony almost made her laugh sometimes. Brett spent years believing Zelda was emotionally weak because she was kind. Meanwhile, she was becoming the most dangerous version of herself, a woman with nothing left to lose emotionally. The condo itself had begun feeling unfamiliar, not because the furniture changed, because Zelda finally saw the emotional architecture of their marriage clearly. Everything revolved around Brett. His schedule, his ambitions, his comfort. Even the artwork on the walls reflected his image preferences more than hers. The realization made her deeply sad. How many tiny pieces of herself had she traded away to keep peace one evening? While reorganizing old storage boxes, Zelda found one of her abandoned branding portfolios from nearly a decade earlier. She sat cross-legged on the floor, flipping through pages slowly. Bold typography, luxury visual concepts, creative campaign structures. She had been good. No, not good. Exceptional. A sharp ache hit her chest suddenly, because she remembered exactly when she stopped believing in herself. Not all at once. Gradually. Brett's career became more urgent. His opportunities became more important. And Zelda quietly convinced herself love meant waiting. Waiting for space. Waiting for support. Waiting for her turn. But some women wait so long they accidentally disappear. A knock at the office doorway startled her. Brett leaned casually against the frame. What's all this? Zelda closed the portfolio gently. Old work. He glanced at the pages briefly. Huh. That was it. Huh. Years of brilliance reduced to one syllable. Then Brett loosened his tie and smiled faintly. You know, once the promotion settles down, maybe you should try getting back into design. The audacity stunned her, as if he hadn't spent years draining the confidence out of her one dismissal at a time. As a hobby, he added. A hobby. Zelda nearly laughed. Instead, she looked at him calmly. Maybe. Something about her tone made Brett pause. He studied her for a moment longer. You've been acting different lately. Different how? I don't know. He frowned slightly. Quiet. Zelda held his gaze steadily. You used to like that about me. The comment unsettled him immediately, because underneath it lived a truth Brett avoided confronting. He benefited enormously from Zelda's silence. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. Victoria. Zelda recognized the expression shift instantly, tiny, automatic. Brett stepped aside while checking the message. Then he looked back up too casually. I need to take this. Of course you do, Zelda thought, but outwardly she only nodded. The second he disappeared onto the balcony, Zelda's expression hardened. Rebecca had been right. Stop reacting emotionally, observe, strategize, prepare. And strangely, the calmer Zelda became the more uneasy Brett seemed around her, because manipulative people expect chaos after betrayal, tears, begging, emotional breakdowns, not silence, not composure, certainly not distance. 2 days before the gala, Brett's mother Diane invited them to lunch at her country club. Zelda almost declined, but Rebecca advised something unexpected: attend everything. Let them underestimate you. So Zelda went. The country club looked exactly like Diane Lawson's personality. Expensive, cold, beautiful in a way that felt emotionally inaccessible. Diane greeted Brett warmly the moment they arrived. "Darling." Then she looked at Zelda. "You look tired." Not "hello," not "nice to see you," just criticism dressed as observation. Zelda smiled politely. "It's been a busy week." Diane stirred her tea delicately. "Well, Brett's entering an entirely new social tier now. These transitions can be demanding for spouses." Spouses? Plural? Like wives were interchangeable accessories. Brett said nothing. Of course he didn't. Then Diane added casually, "I saw Victoria Pierce at the board fundraiser last month." Extraordinary woman. There it was. Zelda glanced at Brett slowly. He suddenly became fascinated by the menu. Diane continued smiling. "She's incredibly polished. Reminds me of the women executive families used to admire when I was younger. Translation, unlike you, the old Zelda would have spent hours crying afterward. This version simply observed the cruelty clinically. Diane wasn't protecting Brett. She was protecting status. And Victoria fit the image better. Toward the end of lunch, Diane leaned toward Zelda slightly. "You know, dear, successful men evolve very quickly. Marriage requires adaptability." The sentence landed exactly the way Diane intended. A warning, an insult, a justification. Zelda looked directly at her for several seconds, then answered softly, "So does self-respect." Diane blinked. Brett looked up immediately. The table went silent. Small moment. But something shifted. For the first time in years, Zelda stopped absorbing disrespect quietly, and everyone noticed. That night, after returning home, Zelda stood alone inside her closet staring at dresses for the promotion gala. Rows of designer gowns hung beneath soft lighting. Most were purchased for Brett's events, Brett's image, Brett's world. Then her eyes landed on a silver silk gown tucked near the back. Simple, elegant, powerful. Brett once told her it was too understated for executive functions, which suddenly made Zelda love it. She tried it on slowly. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized anymore. Not because she looked different, because her eyes did. The desperation was fading, and underneath it, something stronger was emerging. Her phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number. Zelda answered cautiously. "Hello," a calm female voice replied. "Ms. Gilbert, this is Evelyn Carter." Zelda straightened instantly. Brett's CEO. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Evelyn continued smoothly. "No. I'd like to speak with you privately before Thursday's gala." Zelda's heartbeat quickened. "About Brett." A pause. Then Evelyn answered carefully, "I think your husband may have lied to more people than just you." Silence flooded the room. Zelda gripped the phone tighter. Evelyn's tone remained composed, but something underneath it sounded sharp, controlled. "Dangerously informed." "We should talk," Evelyn said quietly. After the call ended, Zelda stood motionless in front of the mirror. Chicago lights shimmered outside the condo windows behind her. Somewhere in another room, Brett laughed softly while texting Victoria, completely unaware, completely confident, still believing he controlled every outcome. But Zelda finally understood something important. Men like Brett don't collapse because of one mistake. They collapse because arrogance convinces them consequences are for other people. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Zelda was no longer preparing to survive the truth. She was preparing to reveal it. Evelyn Carter chose a private restaurant overlooking the Chicago River for their meeting. Of course she did. Nothing about the woman felt accidental. The restaurant was elegant without trying too hard. Soft jazz floated through dim lighting, while executives and politicians murmured over expensive wine behind polished glass walls. Zelda arrived 10 minutes early, not because she wanted to impress Evelyn, because anxiety had been eating through her ribs since the phone call. Brett's CEO wanting a private conversation with her could mean anything, and right now, Zelda trusted almost nothing. When Evelyn entered the restaurant, heads turned automatically, not because she was flashy, because power carried its own atmosphere. She wore a charcoal coat over a tailored black dress, silver hair swept neatly behind one shoulder, mid-50s composed unreadable, the kind of woman who spent decades surviving rooms built to underestimate her. Ms. Gilbert Evelyn greeted warmly as she approached the table. "Please," Zelda said softly. "Zelda is fine." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Then you can call me Evelyn." Once they sat down, silence lingered briefly between them. Not awkward silence. Measured silence. Evelyn studied people carefully before speaking. Zelda could tell immediately. Finally, Evelyn folded her hands. "You look exactly how I expected." Zelda blinked slightly. "I'm not sure what that means." "It means," Evelyn said calmly, "you look like someone who spent a very long time carrying emotional weight quietly." The observation hit so directly, Zelda almost looked away. Instead, she asked carefully, "How much do you know?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. A server poured sparkling water and disappeared again. Only then did Evelyn speak. "I know Brett Lawson is very talented," she said evenly. "I also know talented men sometimes mistake admiration for immunity." Zelda felt her pulse quicken. Evelyn reached into her leather bag and removed a thin folder, then slid it across the table. Zelda opened it slowly. Inside were internal company review documents, performance notes, anonymous concerns, project discrepancies, and one sentence highlighted sharply near the center questions regarding original authorship of hospitality campaign frameworks. Zelda's stomach dropped. Evelyn watched her carefully. "You recognize the work." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Zelda whispered. Evelyn nodded slowly. "I thought so." For several seconds, Zelda couldn't speak. The idea that Brett's company had quietly suspected something all along stunned her. "I don't understand," Zelda finally said. "If there were concerns, why promote him?" Evelyn leaned back slightly. "Corporate America rewards results first." Her expression hardened faintly. Ethics usually become important only after liability appears. The honesty of the statement startled Zelda. No corporate politeness, no fake morality, just truth. Evelyn took a slow sip of water. "I reviewed Brett's promotion file personally last month," she continued. "Some strategic concepts felt inconsistent with his previous work history." Zelda's fingers tightened around the folder. And then I met Victoria Pierce." Something sharp flickered behind Evelyn's calm expression. "She's intelligent," Evelyn admitted, "but ambitious in dangerous ways." Zelda looked down quietly. "I think they're planning a future together." Evelyn didn't seem surprised. "Yes." The directness hurt anyway. Even hearing another woman confirm it made the betrayal feel heavier somehow. "I'm sorry," Evelyn added quietly. And strangely, Zelda believed her. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone powerful wasn't speaking to her like collateral damage. Evelyn was speaking to her like a person. "May I ask you something difficult?" Evelyn said. Zelda nodded. "Why did you stay quiet so long?" The question wasn't cruel, but it still pierced straight through her. Zelda stared out the window toward the river below. "I loved him." Evelyn remained silent, and honestly, Zelda gave a hollow laugh. "I think I kept believing if I sacrificed enough, eventually he'd remember who we used to be." Evelyn's eyes softened briefly. "That's not weakness." Zelda looked back at her. "It feels like it." "No." Evelyn's voice sharpened slightly. "Weakness is using love as a weapon against loyal people." The sentence settled deep inside Zelda's chest, because suddenly she understood something important. Her kindness had never been the problem. Brett's entitlement was. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "There's something else you should know." Zelda straightened. Brett's promotion was not finalized because of leadership qualities alone. Evelyn's tone became colder. The hospitality campaign positioned him as the future face of strategic innovation at the firm. Zelda already knew where this was going, and those ideas were mine. Yes. Hearing someone else say it aloud made the room feel strangely quiet, like reality had finally stopped gaslighting her. Evelyn continued carefully. If those concepts were stolen intellectual property, the consequences become much larger than an affair. Corporate fraud, misrepresentation, career-ending implications. Zelda swallowed hard. Part of her wanted revenge desperately, but another part still mourned the man she thought Brett used to be. Evelyn seemed to sense the conflict immediately. "You still love him," she observed. Zelda looked away. "I don't know who I love anymore." That answer lingered heavily between them. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "When I was 38, my husband had an affair with a junior partner at my old firm." Zelda blinked surprised. Evelyn smiled faintly without humor. "He told everyone I became too ambitious to love properly." The bitterness beneath the sentence was ancient. Controlled, but still alive. "What happened?" Zelda asked quietly. "I lost my marriage," Evelyn said simply. "But eventually I realized I lost something worse before that." "What, myself?" The honesty in her voice made Zelda's chest ache. For a moment, the age difference between them disappeared completely. They were just two women sitting across from each other, comparing scars men left behind. Evelyn folded her hands again. "The reason I asked to meet you," she said carefully, "is because I believe you deserve the truth before Thursday." Zelda's heartbeat slowed. "What truth?" Evelyn's expression sharpened slightly. "Your husband thinks he's untouchable." A chill moved through Zelda instantly. Evelyn continued. "Brett has been positioning Victoria internally for months. He requested she join his executive division immediately after the promotion announcement, exactly like the text message implied. After your promotion, we won't have to hide anymore. They were planning a public transition," Zelda whispered. "Yes." The cruelty of it hollowed her out briefly. Not just cheating. Replacement. Calculated replacement. Evelyn watched her carefully. "Can I ask what you intend to do?" Zelda sat very still. For weeks, anger consumed her. Humiliation. Grief. But now something calmer existed underneath it. "I want him to finally hear the truth," she said softly. Evelyn nodded slowly. "Good." That answer surprised Zelda. "You agree, I agree. Manipulative men rarely stop until consequences become visible." Evelyn's tone turned colder. And frankly, Brett Lawson has confused charm with character for far too long. The room fell quiet again. Outside, Chicago traffic shimmered beneath evening lights. Finally, Evelyn reached into her bag one last time and removed a small silver envelope. Inside was the formal gala itinerary for Brett's promotion night. Zelda's eyes scanned the schedule. Executive speeches, awards, recognition segment, then one handwritten note near the bottom. Guest remarks, spouse acknowledgement. Zelda looked up slowly. Evelyn held her gaze steadily. "When I hand you that microphone," she said quietly, "tell the truth." The words sent chills across Zelda's skin, because suddenly the future became terrifyingly clear. The ballroom, the executives, Victoria, Brett, the carefully constructed image he spent years protecting, and Zelda standing in the center of it all with the power to destroy the illusion. "You're giving me a choice," Zelda whispered. "No," Evelyn corrected calmly. "I'm giving you permission to stop protecting someone who never protected you." Silence swallowed the table afterward. Heavy, emotional, transformative. Then something unexpected happened. Zelda smiled, not because she was happy, because for the first time in years, she no longer felt powerless. Across the city, Brett Lawson was still rehearsing victory speeches in expensive suits, still believing he controlled every narrative, still convinced his wife would stay silent beside him, smiling beautifully, while he erased her existence completely. But he made one catastrophic mistake. He forgot that women who survive emotional devastation eventually stop fearing consequences. And once that happens, they become impossible to control. The night of Brett Lawson's promotion gala arrived glittering with cold Chicago rain and artificial perfection. From the outside, the rooftop ballroom looked like a dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, while chandeliers scattered gold light across polished marble floors. Waiters floated through the crowd, carrying crystal champagne flutes. Executives in tailored tuxedos laughed too loudly beside women wearing diamonds that cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Everything shimmered. Everything lied. And somewhere beneath all that luxury, Zelda felt strangely calm. Not happy, not nervous, just clear. She stood alone in the master bathroom of the condo, staring at herself in the mirror, while fastening diamond earrings slowly. The silver silk gown fit her like quiet revenge. Elegant, understated, powerful. Brett stepped into the doorway behind her, adjusting his cufflinks. For a moment he simply stared, and Zelda noticed it instantly. The surprise. The reminder. He had spent so long overlooking her that seeing her radiant again almost unsettled him. "You look—" Brett paused. Zelda met his eyes through the mirror. "What, beautiful?" The word landed awkwardly between them. Too late. Far too late. Still, part of her hated how her heart reacted automatically to his approval after all this time. Trauma and love often share the same language. "Thank you," she said calmly. Brett stepped closer. "You've been different lately." There it was again. That growing discomfort inside him, because Zelda no longer chased reassurance, no longer cried, no longer begged him to choose her, and men like Brett panic when emotional control disappears. "You nervous about tonight?" he asked casually. Zelda looked back at her reflection. No. That answer visibly unsettled him. The drive downtown passed mostly in silence. Rain streaked across the windows while Chicago glowed silver beneath the storm clouds. Brett checked his phone constantly. Victoria, work messages, executives, image management. Zelda watched him carefully beside her. For years she mistook his ambition for strength. Now she saw the addiction underneath it. Validation, admiration, status. Brett didn't just want success. He needed people to witness it. The rooftop ballroom buzzed with energy the moment they arrived. The promotion announcement had become one of the biggest internal events the firm hosted all year. Investors, executives, media partners, and senior consultants filled the space dressed in wealth and ego. The second Brett entered, attention shifted toward him automatically. Handshakes, congratulations, laughter. Power recognized power. And beside him Zelda played her role perfectly. Graceful smile, elegant posture, calm silence. The supportive wife. Except this time she wasn't shrinking. That difference changed everything. Several people complimented her dress almost immediately. "You look stunning tonight, absolutely breathtaking." "Brett's a lucky man." Brett smiled proudly each time, possessively, like her beauty still belonged to him. The irony nearly made Zelda laugh. Across the ballroom, Victoria Pierce finally appeared, and for the first time since discovering the affair, Zelda felt nothing. No jealousy, no panic, no desperate need to compete, because once a woman truly sees her worth again, comparison loses power completely. Victoria wore a fitted ivory gown that screamed expensive taste. Her blonde hair fell in polished waves while the infamous Cartier bracelet glittered beneath chandelier light. She approached Brett immediately. Of course she did. "Congratulations," Victoria purred warmly, touching his arm lightly. Brett smiled at her with that same intimate softness Zelda used to crave. "You look incredible." Victoria's eyes shifted toward Zelda. For one brief second, uncertainty flickered there, because something about Zelda tonight felt different. Not broken, not defeated. Dangerously composed. "You clean up well," Victoria said lightly. Zelda smiled politely. "So do you." The tension beneath the exchange crackled quietly. Brett sensed it too. His shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. Good, Zelda thought. Let him feel uncomfortable for once. As the evening continued, Brett moved through the ballroom, shaking hands and accepting praise like oxygen. Every compliment fed him visibly. "You earned this. Future partner material, brilliant leadership." Zelda watched the performance carefully. Nobody here knew the truth. Nobody knew the visionary strategist standing beside the champagne tower built portions of his career using his wife's creativity while emotionally dismantling her behind closed doors. The disconnect felt surreal. At one point, Zelda stepped onto the outdoor terrace alone for air. Rain misted lightly across the city while music pulsed softly behind glass walls. "You're handling this remarkably well." Evelyn Carter appeared beside her, holding a champagne flute. Zelda smiled faintly. "I'm dissociating professionally." That actually made Evelyn laugh quietly. Then her expression softened. "You don't owe anyone composure tonight." "Yes," Zelda said softly. "I do." Because now she understood something important. If she screamed, Brett would become the victim. If she lost control emotionally, people would dismiss her pain as instability. No. Tonight required precision. Evelyn studied her carefully. "Are you certain?" Zelda looked through the ballroom windows toward Brett. He stood near Victoria, laughing with senior executives, while one hand rested casually against Victoria's lower back. Publicly careless now. confident, arrogant. Certain Zelda would stay silent. Yes, Zelda answered quietly. Evelyn nodded once. Then she handed Zelda a small remote control device for the presentation screen. Zelda stared down at it. Inside her chest, her heartbeat suddenly slowed. Reality crystallized sharply. This was actually happening. Across the ballroom, Brett suddenly looked toward them, and for one strange second, their eyes locked through the glass. A flicker of unease crossed his expression immediately. Like instinct warned him something was wrong, but arrogance silenced it, as always. The event coordinator soon tapped the microphone near the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, if we could gather for tonight's promotion recognition ceremony." Applause filled the ballroom. Guests moved toward the massive stage overlooking Chicago's skyline. Brett adjusted his jacket confidently. Victoria smiled beside him. Diane Lawson sat proudly near the front row, already glowing with social satisfaction. And Zelda? Zelda felt eerily calm, like she had already mourned this marriage long before tonight arrived. The ceremony began smoothly. Executive speeches, corporate achievements, strategic milestones. Then finally Evelyn stepped onto the stage beneath bright lights. Tonight, she announced gracefully, "We celebrate leadership innovation and the future of this company." Applause erupted. Brett smiled proudly. Evelyn continued. "There is one individual whose work has significantly shaped the direction of our executive expansion efforts." More applause. "Please join me in congratulating our new senior vice president." She paused dramatically. "Brett Lawson." The ballroom exploded with cheers. Brett walked onto the stage glowing with triumph, confident, admired, victorious. Exactly the way he imagined this night for months. Zelda watched him carefully while cameras flashed around the room. Then Brett began his speech. He thanked executives, mentors, the company, and finally special thanks Brett said smoothly to Victoria Pierce, whose support and partnership have been invaluable during this process. The room applauded politely. Victoria smiled like she'd already won, and somewhere deep inside himself, Brett made his final mistake. He forgot Zelda was still standing there. Evelyn stepped back onto the stage beside him, champagne glass raised elegantly. "And before we conclude," she said warmly, "I think we'd all love to hear a few words from the woman who stood beside Brett through this incredible journey." Brett froze. The color drained from his face instantly, because suddenly he understood. Evelyn turned gracefully toward Zelda, then handed her the microphone. The microphone felt strangely light in Zelda's hand, almost weightless, which was ironic considering it carried the power to destroy everything Brett Lawson spent years building. The ballroom fell into polite silence as she stepped onto the stage beside him. Hundreds of eyes turned toward her instantly, executives, investors, corporate wives, friends, enemies pretending to be friends. And somewhere near the front row, Victoria Pierce sat perfectly still with one manicured hand wrapped tightly around her champagne glass. Brett leaned closer to Zelda, subtly smile, frozen painfully on his face. "What are you doing?" he whispered through clenched teeth. Zelda looked at him calmly. Something in her expression made real fear flash across his eyes for the first time. Not irritation, not annoyance. Fear. Good. Evelyn stepped aside gracefully, allowing Zelda center stage. The Chicago skyline glittered behind her through towering glass windows, while chandeliers reflected gold across the silent ballroom. Zelda looked out at the crowd slowly, then finally lifted the microphone. "I want to thank my husband," she began softly, "for teaching me what betrayal sounds like behind closed doors." The room froze instantly. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter flickered through the audience before dying completely. Brett's face lost all color. "Zelda," she continued before he could interrupt. "For 10 years, I believed loyalty meant standing beside someone through everything." Her voice remained calm. "I believed love meant sacrifice, patience, forgiveness." The silence deepened. Across the ballroom, people exchanged confused glances. Some executives looked toward Evelyn immediately, but Evelyn simply stood quietly watching, waiting. Zelda's hands remained perfectly steady, and for a long time she continued, "I thought supporting my husband's dreams made me a good wife." Brett stepped closer again, voice low and panicked now. "Stop." Zelda ignored him, because for the first time in years, she wasn't emotionally reacting to Brett. She was finally speaking over him. The difference changed everything. "I supported Brett through graduate school," she said into the microphone. "I worked while he built his career. I helped prepare presentations. I managed our home. I cared for his family." Diane Lawson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Zelda saw it. Good. I gave up my own design career because I believed we were building a life together. Brett's jaw tightened hard. The audience remained completely silent now. No music, no movement, just tension thick enough to choke on. Then Zelda turned slightly toward Brett, and somewhere along the way she said quietly, "My husband stopped seeing me as a person." The sentence landed brutally. Not because she yelled it, because she didn't. Brett suddenly reached toward her arm. Enough. Zelda stepped away before he could touch her. That small movement changed the entire room instantly. People noticed. The fear in Brett's face became impossible to hide now. His polished executive mask had started cracking publicly, and once powerful men lose control of perception, they panic. "You told me I stopped being interesting," Zelda continued calmly. "You told me I became emotionally heavy. You told me successful men evolve." Victoria looked visibly pale now, because suddenly she realized this wasn't private marital drama anymore. This was exposure, public exposure. And while I was shrinking myself trying to save my marriage, Zelda continued, "My husband was having an affair with a coworker." Gasps finally spread across the ballroom. Sharp, audible, real. Someone dropped a champagne glass somewhere near the back. Brett closed his eyes briefly like he'd been punched. "Zelda?" He hissed, "Think carefully," but she already had. For weeks. For years, maybe. Zelda looked directly toward Victoria now. The entire room followed her gaze instantly. Victoria sat frozen beneath hundreds of staring eyes, elegant masks collapsing by the second. "I found the messages," Zelda said softly. "The gifts, the hidden accounts." Victoria opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again. Because what defense existed anymore, Brett tried recovering quickly. "This is a misunderstanding," he said loudly, forcing a laugh. "My wife's emotional right now." Emotional. The word echoed through the ballroom like a cliché, and suddenly Zelda realized something almost funny. Manipulative men always sound painfully predictable once you stop loving them blindly. Zelda smiled faintly. "No," she said calmly into the microphone. "For the first time in years, I'm actually thinking clearly." That line hit the room differently. Several women lowered their eyes instantly because they understood exactly what she meant. Zelda reached into her clutch purse slowly. Brett noticed immediately. His entire body tensed. "Don't," he whispered. "Too late." Zelda lifted the small presentation remote Evelyn gave her earlier, then clicked once. The giant projector screens behind the stage flickered to life instantly, and suddenly the ballroom walls filled with documents. Original branding drafts, time-stamped files, design concepts, all under one name. Zelda Gilbert. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. Brett visibly stumbled backward half a step. His face went completely white. "I helped build the campaign that earned Brett Lawson this promotion," Zelda said quietly. Silence. "Actually," her voice sharpened slightly, "that's not true." Another click. More files appeared. Original drafts beside Brett's submitted corporate presentations. Side-by-side comparisons. Undeniable. "He didn't just betray our marriage," Zelda continued. "He stole my work while convincing me I was becoming less valuable." Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Brett looked toward Evelyn desperately now, but Evelyn didn't move. Didn't rescue him, didn't interrupt. Because truth requires witnesses. "You called me emotional," Zelda said, eyes fixed on Brett now. "But what you really meant was inconvenient." Brett's breathing looked uneven suddenly. "Turn this off," he snapped. Zelda tilted her head slightly. "Why?" she asked softly. "Truth making you uncomfortable." The audience reacted audibly to that. Because for the first time all night, Brett Lawson no longer looked powerful. He looked exposed. Human, small. Victoria finally stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate," she said sharply. "This isn't the place for personal issues." Zelda looked at her calmly. "You're right." The room went still again. Affairs usually happen behind closed doors. Victoria's expression hardened instantly, but Zelda kept going. "You wore my husband's gifts proudly while sitting in my home eating meals I cooked for you." Zelda's voice never rose. "So don't pretend dignity matters now." That one cut deep. Victoria looked genuinely shaken, and Brett looked terrified. Not because Zelda was yelling, because she wasn't. Calm women frighten manipulative men more than angry ones ever will. Zelda turned back toward the audience slowly. "For years I confused kindness with obligation," she said quietly. I thought being a good woman meant enduring disrespect silently. Tears burned her eyes now, but her voice never broke. It doesn't. The ballroom remained completely still. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. And suddenly Zelda realized something powerful. Nobody pitied her anymore. They respected her. Because strength isn't loud. Sometimes strength is simply refusing to protect the person destroying you. Zelda looked directly at Brett one final time, the man she once loved more than herself, the man who thought she would stay silent forever. Then she delivered the sentence that shattered whatever remained of his illusion. Everything Brett Lawson became, she said softly, was built on the woman he thought nobody would believe. Silence crashed through the ballroom afterward. Heavy. Absolute. And for the first time all night, Brett Lawson looked completely alone. The silence after Zelda's speech felt almost violent. Not quiet. Violent, because entire lives had just shifted in front of hundreds of witnesses. No music played anymore, no glasses clinked, no polite executive laughter floated through the ballroom. Only shock. Pure shock. Brett stood frozen beneath the chandelier lights, staring at the giant screens displaying Zelda's original work beside his stolen presentations. For the first time in his adult life, admiration had disappeared from the room. And without admiration, Brett Lawson looked fragile. Someone near the back whispered, "Is this real?" Another voice answered quietly, "It has to be." Victoria finally found her voice first. "This is insane," she snapped sharply, stepping toward the stage. "She's manipulating the narrative." Zelda looked at her calmly. The irony almost hurt. Manipulating the narrative. That was exactly what Brett and Victoria had spent years doing. Victoria turned desperately toward the executives. "You can't seriously believe this ambush?" "We believe timestamps," Evelyn interrupted coldly. The entire ballroom stilled again. Evelyn Carter stepped forward slowly beneath the stage lights, her expression unreadable now. But her voice ice. "Our internal systems have already verified authorship discrepancies in the campaign materials." Brett's face completely drained of color. "Evelyn, no." Her gaze cut directly toward him. "You'll remain silent while I speak." That alone stunned the room, because powerful men like Brett almost never heard the word no publicly, especially not from other powerful people. Brett swallowed hard. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Evelyn said calmly. Then she turned toward the audience. "This company values innovation." Her tone sharpened. "But we do not reward intellectual theft or unethical conduct." The words echoed through the ballroom like a verdict. Several executives immediately avoided eye contact with Brett. Others quietly stepped farther away, and Zelda noticed the exact moment panic truly entered Brett's body. Not when she exposed the affair, not when the evidence appeared, but now, because his career, the thing he loved most, was slipping beyond his control. "Evelyn," Brett said carefully, trying to regain composure, "this is deeply personal and clearly emotional." "There it is. Again?" Zelda interrupted softly. Brett turned toward her sharply. That word. Emotional. Zelda stepped down from the stage, slowly, microphone still in hand. "You used that word every time I got too close to the truth." The room listened carefully now. Not because of drama, because everyone suddenly recognized the pattern. Gaslighting sounds obvious once someone names it aloud. Victoria crossed her arms defensively. "You're trying to destroy him." Zelda looked directly at her. "No," she said quietly. "I'm just finally refusing to destroy myself for him anymore." That line moved through the ballroom like electricity. Several women visibly reacted. Even some men lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Because deep down, everyone knew someone who survived relationships like this. Maybe quietly, maybe invisibly. But they knew. Brett suddenly stepped toward Zelda, lowering his voice urgently. "We can fix this privately." Zelda almost laughed. Privately? Of course, because men like Brett only value privacy when consequences arrive publicly. "You told me losing you would be the biggest mistake of my life," Zelda said softly. Brett glanced nervously around the room. "Not here." "No," Zelda replied calmly. "Exactly here." The humiliation finally hit him completely then. The room, the witnesses, the executives whispering behind champagne glasses, the investors checking their phones, the destruction of image. Brett Lawson could survive losing love, but he could not survive losing admiration. Diane Lawson suddenly stood from her table abruptly. "This is enough," she snapped loudly. "Zelda, you're humiliating this family." Family. The word almost fascinated Zelda now, because Diane never defended her when Brett humiliated her privately, only now when public reputation suffered. Zelda turned slowly toward her mother-in-law. With respect, Diane. Zelda's voice remained perfectly composed. Your son humiliated this family long before I ever touched a microphone. Diane looked stunned, truly stunned, because Zelda had never spoken back before, not once in 10 years. And suddenly Diane realized the same terrifying thing Brett already had. The woman they underestimated no longer needed their approval. Victoria's composure cracked next. This is ridiculous, she hissed toward Brett. Do something. That one sentence exposed everything. Not concern, not love. Control. Because Victoria didn't actually love Brett either. She loved proximity to power. And now that power looked unstable. Brett ran a trembling hand through his hair. Victoria stopped talking. Oh, now you want me quiet, she shot back. The tension exploded instantly. Zelda stepped back slightly, watching calmly while the two people who betrayed her started turning against each other in real time. Predictable. Affairs built on ego rarely survive exposure. Victoria laughed bitterly. You promised me this would be handled. Several heads turned sharply. Brett's expression became murderous. Victoria? No. She stepped closer now, voice rising emotionally. You told me she was weak. The sentence shattered whatever remained of Brett's image. Zelda watched him carefully, because suddenly he looked exactly like what he truly was, beneath the expensive suits and executive titles, a frightened man losing control. Victoria's breathing grew uneven. You said she'd never leave you. The ballroom erupted into whispers instantly, and Zelda realized something profound in that moment. Brett didn't just manipulate her. He manipulated everyone. Different versions of himself for different audiences. The loyal husband, the visionary executive, the passionate lover, the misunderstood son. But none of those men were real. Only the hunger underneath them was real. Evelyn finally stepped forward again. Brett Lawson, she announced calmly. Effective immediately, your promotion review is suspended pending formal investigation. The room went dead silent. Corporate death sentence. Everyone knew it. Brett stared at Evelyn like he physically couldn't process the words. You can't do this. I already did. His breathing visibly changed, faster now. Shallower. For the first time all night, Brett looked truly terrified. After everything I've done for this company, Evelyn's expression remained cold. No, Brett. She paused carefully. After everything others did for you. That one hit perfectly, because finally someone powerful said aloud what Zelda spent years silently surviving. Brett looked toward Zelda desperately then. Not lovingly, desperately, like he suddenly remembered her value only after losing access to it. Please, he said quietly. The word stunned her. Brett Lawson never said please emotionally, not anymore. But Zelda felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, only exhaustion, because revenge fantasies never show the grief afterward. The grief of realizing the person you loved never truly existed the way you believed. Victoria suddenly grabbed her purse. I'm not going down alone. Brett's eyes widened instantly. What does that mean? Victoria laughed sharply through tears. It means I saved the messages, Brett. Oh. The room shifted again. Even Evelyn looked interested now. Victoria's mascara had started smudging slightly beneath the ballroom lights. You told me you'd leave her after the promotion, she said bitterly. You said Zelda was just emotionally convenient. The cruelty of hearing it aloud should have destroyed Zelda. Instead, it freed her completely, because now there were no illusions left to protect. Brett looked physically sick. Victoria, stop, but she was spiraling now. You said she was too dependent to survive alone? Several people gasped audibly. And finally, Brett Lawson looked exactly the way Zelda felt for years, exposed, humiliated, powerless. Zelda slowly removed her wedding ring. The diamond caught the chandelier light one final time. 10 years, promises, history, pain. She walked calmly toward the nearest champagne table where Brett's untouched glass still sat waiting beside his promotion plaque. Then gently, almost tenderly, she placed the ring beside it. The symbolism hit the room instantly. Marriage over, image shattered, fantasy dead. Brett stared at the ring like it physically wounded him. Zelda. But she simply looked at him one last time. And for the first time since falling in love with Brett Lawson, she no longer saw the man she wanted back. She only saw the lesson. Then Zelda turned quietly and walked away while the ballroom collapsed behind her. The divorce conference room smelled like coffee paper and controlled resentment. 3 weeks had passed since the gala. 3 weeks since Brett Lawson's public unraveling became corporate gossip across Chicago's executive circles. 3 weeks since Zelda walked out of the ballroom wearing silver silk and emotional exhaustion. And somehow, everything looked different now, especially Brett. He sat across from her at the long mahogany table wearing a charcoal suit that suddenly looked too expensive for the man inside it. The confidence was gone. Not completely. Men like Brett never lose arrogance all at once, but the performance had cracks now, visible ones. His promotion investigation remained active. Several clients quietly distanced themselves from him. Internal executives stopped returning calls as quickly. Victoria Pierce had already hired separate legal counsel. The empire was shaking, and for the first time in 10 years, Zelda wasn't the one emotionally collapsing. Rebecca Sterling organized documents calmly beside her, sharp, prepared, unbothered. Brett's attorney, Martin Hale, adjusted his glasses awkwardly while reviewing financial summaries. Nobody spoke at first. Rain tapped softly against the law office windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Finally, Brett looked directly at Zelda. "You really went through with this." The sentence almost amused her, as if divorce were somehow more shocking than betrayal. Rebecca answered before Zelda could. "My client is proceeding appropriately under Illinois marital law." Brett ignored her completely. His eyes stayed fixed on Zelda. "You embarrassed me publicly." There it was. Not "I hurt you." Not "I'm sorry." Not "I destroyed our marriage." No. His first emotional instinct was still humiliation. Zelda folded her hands quietly. "You embarrassed yourself publicly?" The sentence landed harder than yelling ever could. Brett's jaw tightened immediately. Martin cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should focus on asset division." "No," Brett interrupted sharply. His eyes never left Zelda. "I want to understand why she's doing this." Rebecca almost smiled. "She's divorcing you, Mr. Lawson." The reasons seemed fairly documented. Brett finally looked frustrated. "Can everyone stop treating me like a criminal?" Silence. Then Rebecca spoke calmly. "You transferred marital funds to your affair partner while concealing intellectual ownership fraud tied to executive advancement." A pause. "That's not exactly husband of the year behavior." Even Martin looked uncomfortable. Brett leaned back hard in his chair. "You make it sound malicious." Zelda stared at him quietly. The terrifying part was, he meant that. Deep down, Brett genuinely viewed his actions as justified responses to ambition, stress, and emotional dissatisfaction. That realization no longer hurt her. It fascinated her. Because she finally understood something critical. People like Brett rarely see themselves as villains. They see themselves as deserving. "I loved you," Zelda said softly. The room fell still instantly. Brett's expression flickered. Real emotion this time. "You don't think I know that?" "No," Zelda answered honestly. "I don't think you ever really understood what it cost me." Something in his face cracked briefly, because for the first time he wasn't arguing with a crying wife desperate to save the marriage. He was facing a woman who no longer needed his validation to tell the truth. And that terrified him. Martin cautiously redirected the conversation toward finances, property distribution, retirement accounts, investment holdings. Rebecca handled everything with surgical precision. Every hidden transfer Brett attempted to bury surfaced eventually. Every concealed account. Every suspicious movement of money. The more evidence appeared, the more Brett's composure deteriorated. "This is excessive," he snapped at one point. Rebecca barely looked up from her notes. "No, it's thorough." Zelda remained mostly quiet during negotiations. Not because she was weak, because she finally understood silence differently now. Silence wasn't surrender. Sometimes silence was observation, and what Zelda observed today devastated her more than the affair ever did. Brett still thought he was the victim. At one point, during a break, he cornered her privately near the office windows. The city stretched beneath them in cold gray light. "I can't believe you're destroying everything over one mistake." Zelda turned slowly toward him. "One mistake," Brett exhaled sharply. "You know what I mean?" "No," she said quietly. "I don't." His frustration surfaced immediately. This didn't have to become a public execution. There it was again. Image. Always image. Even now, Brett mourned reputation more deeply than betrayal. You cheated on me, Zelda said calmly. You stole from me. You manipulated me for years. I was under pressure. Zelda actually laughed softly. The sound startled him. Do you hear yourself? Brett rubbed his forehead angrily. You act like I never loved you. The sentence hit unexpectedly hard. Because once upon a time, she believed he did. Maybe part of him even had. But love without respect mutates into ownership eventually. Zelda looked out toward the skyline. I think you loved how I made you feel about yourself. Brett went quiet. Because that one landed too close to truth. You needed someone who made your life easier, she continued softly. Someone who admired you unconditionally. That's not fair. No, Zelda agreed. What you did wasn't fair. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Brett's voice lowered. I miss you. The words should have shattered her. Months ago, they would have. Now they only made her sad. Because finally she understood the difference between missing a person and missing access to them. You don't miss me, Zelda said gently. Brett frowned. You miss the version of me that tolerated everything? His expression hardened instantly. That's not true? Then tell me one thing you loved about me that didn't benefit you. Silence. Complete silence. Brett opened his mouth, closed it again, and in that devastating pause, everything became clear. Zelda's chest tightened painfully, not because he failed the question, because once upon a time she would have answered it for him. Creative, kind, funny, loyal, warm. But Brett had spent so long consuming her emotional labor, he stopped seeing her independently from what she provided him. Finally, he spoke quietly. You were always there for me. Exactly. Not who she was, what she gave. Tears burned Zelda's eyes instantly, but this time they weren't tears begging to be loved. They were grief for the woman who accepted crumbs for years thinking they were devotion. You know the saddest part, Zelda whispered. Brett looked at her carefully. I would have stayed. His face changed completely. Shock. Real shock. Even after everything, she continued softly, I still wanted to believe you could become the man I married again. The vulnerability in her voice finally cracked something inside him. Zelda. But then I realized something. Her eyes locked onto his. You stopped seeing my love as a gift. Silence. You started seeing it as permission. That sentence hollowed the air between them, because deep down, Brett knew it was true. Rebecca eventually called them back to the table. The negotiations resumed, and by late afternoon the settlement terms were finalized. Financial compensation, intellectual ownership acknowledgement, asset division, clean separation. Brett signed last. His hand actually trembled slightly. Zelda noticed. So did he. After the documents were complete, Martin quietly left the room first. Then Rebecca stepped outside to take a call, leaving Zelda and Brett alone together one final time. The silence felt enormous. Finally, Brett looked up. I never thought you'd actually leave. There it was. The truest thing he said all day. Not an apology, an admission. Because men like Brett often believe loyal women have infinite tolerance, until one day they don't. Zelda stood slowly gathering her coat. You know what's funny? She said quietly. Brett looked at her. For years you made me feel powerless. Her voice stayed calm. But sitting across from you now? Zelda gave a faint, sad smile. I finally realized you were terrified of losing me long before I stopped being afraid to leave. Brett looked devastated suddenly. Not performatively. Not strategically. Actually devastated. Too late. Always too late. Zelda turned toward the door. Then Rebecca re-entered, holding her phone. There's one more thing Rebecca said. Zelda paused. Rebecca smiled slightly. Evelyn Carter would like to discuss a business opportunity with you. Brett's face changed instantly, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Zelda saw something inside him finally break completely, because suddenly he understood. She wasn't just surviving without him. She was about to become something more. 6 months after the divorce, Zelda Gilbert stood alone inside her new studio, watching sunlight spill across unfinished hardwood floors. The space smelled like fresh paint, coffee, and possibility. For the first time in years, the silence around her felt peaceful, not lonely, peaceful. A gold plaque rested beside the entrance door waiting to be mounted. Gilbert Creative Studio. Just seeing her own name there still felt surreal. For so long, Zelda existed as an extension of someone else's identity. Brett's wife, Brett's support system, Brett's background character. Now she was becoming visible again. Slowly, painfully, beautifully. The studio itself sat inside a renovated brick building in Chicago's West Loop Modern without feeling cold. Large industrial windows flooded the open space with natural light, while exposed beams gave the room warmth and character. Zelda designed every detail herself. Of course she did. Soft, neutral textures, clean luxury branding, elegant lighting, a space built for creativity instead of performance. It felt like rebuilding a nervous system from scratch. The first few months after the divorce had been brutal, not dramatically, quietly. There were mornings Zelda woke up instinctively reaching toward the other side of the bed before remembering Brett no longer belonged there. There were nights she cried in the shower grieving the future she thought she would have. Not grieving Brett exactly. Grieving hope. Grieving the woman who kept believing love alone could heal disrespect. Healing, she discovered, wasn't cinematic. It was repetitive. Therapy appointments, boundary setting, learning how to eat dinner alone without feeling abandoned. Learning that peace can initially feel uncomfortable when chaos becomes familiar. Rebecca Sterling checked in often. Evelyn Carter became unexpectedly supportive. And little by little, Zelda started returning to herself. Not the younger, naive version. A stronger one. A wiser one. One afternoon, Zelda sat across from her therapist, twisting a paper coffee cup nervously. "I still feel angry sometimes," she admitted quietly. Dr. Nina Alvarez nodded gently. "That's normal. But I don't want bitterness to define me. It won't," Nina said calmly. "Not if you process it honestly instead of burying it." Zelda looked down. "I wasted 10 years. Nina's expression softened. "No," she corrected carefully. "You survived 10 years learning what happens when self-worth depends entirely on being chosen." The sentence stayed with Zelda for weeks afterward, because deep down she knew it was true. She didn't just lose herself in marriage. She abandoned herself trying to earn permanent love from someone emotionally incapable of valuing sacrifice properly. And somehow, that realization no longer made her ashamed. It made her free. Professionally, life transformed faster than she expected. Evelyn hired Zelda as an independent branding consultant after the corporate investigation concluded officially. Brett Lawson resigned before termination proceedings finalized. Victoria Pierce quietly disappeared from the firm shortly afterward. Neither outcome brought Zelda satisfaction, only closure. Meanwhile, the hospitality campaign scandal unexpectedly opened doors. Industry publications began quietly crediting Zelda's original strategic work after legal ownership reviews surfaced internally. At first, she hated the attention. Then she realized something important. Visibility isn't arrogance when you spent years being erased. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Zelda stood inside the studio reviewing client mock-ups when her assistant Maya rushed in, holding a business magazine. "Oh my God," Maya nearly shouted. "You're on page 32? Zelda blinked. "What?" Maya flipped the magazine open dramatically. There it was. A full-page feature about emerging independent creative consultants reshaping luxury branding spaces. And right in the center, Zelda Gilbert. The article praised her elegant emotional intelligence in strategic storytelling and referenced her role in several high-profile hospitality campaigns. No mention of Brett. No mention of scandal. Just her work, her talent, her name. Zelda stared at the page silently. Then, unexpectedly, she cried. Not from sadness, from grief for the woman who once believed she was forgettable. Maya panicked instantly. "Oh no, are those bad tears?" Zelda laughed through them softly. "No." She touched the magazine page carefully. "They're healing tears." Outside the studio windows, Chicago pulsed with movement and noise. But inside herself, something finally settled. That evening, Zelda walked home alone carrying flowers she bought for herself from a small market near the river. That still felt revolutionary somehow. Buying herself flowers, cooking meals she genuinely enjoyed, decorating spaces without worrying whether a man found them practical. Tiny freedoms, tiny rebellions, tiny acts of self-love. Her apartment reflected the same transformation. Warm lighting, books everywhere, fresh eucalyptus in glass vases, Soft music instead of tense silence. The home finally felt emotionally safe. No walking on eggshells, no monitoring moods, no shrinking. Sometimes Zelda still caught herself expecting criticism automatically. You're too emotional, too sensitive, too much. Brett's voice lived inside old wounds longer than she liked admitting. But slowly new truths replaced the old ones. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to have needs. You're allowed to leave environments that destroy your spirit. Healing wasn't about becoming unbreakable. It was about finally believing you deserved gentleness too. Late one evening, Zelda stayed at the studio alone, finishing revisions for a luxury hotel client when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered absently. Hello, silence. Then a familiar voice. Zelda. Her entire body stilled instantly. Brett. She hadn't heard his voice in almost 2 months. How did you get this number? I asked Rebecca. Of course he did. Rain tapped softly against the studio windows while silence stretched between them. Finally, Brett spoke again. I saw the article. Zelda closed her eyes briefly. And you look happy. The sentence sounded strange coming from him. Fragile somehow. I'm getting there, she answered honestly. Another long silence. Then Brett laughed softly under his breath. You know what's terrifying. Zelda leaned back slowly in her chair. What I used to think you needed me. There was no arrogance left in his voice now, only regret. Zelda looked around her studio quietly. The sketches, the mood boards, the future she rebuilt from emotional ashes. No, she said softly. I needed myself. Silence. Heavy silence. Then Brett asked the question she always thought she wanted to hear. Did you ever really stop loving me? The old Zelda would have collapsed emotionally hearing that. This version simply breathed carefully before answering. I stopped loving who I became with you. That answer shattered something quietly between them. Brett exhaled shakily. I miss you every day. And maybe he meant it. Maybe losing her finally forced him to confront the emptiness underneath ambition. But some realizations arrive after irreversible damage. Zelda's voice stayed gentle. I know. Another pause. Then Brett spoke almost nervously. Could I see you sometime? Zelda looked out the studio window toward the glowing Chicago skyline. Months ago, she would have heard hope in that question. Now she heard history trying to reopen itself, and Zelda finally understood something powerful. Missing someone is not the same thing as deserving access to them again. Before she could answer, movement outside the studio caught her attention. A figure standing beneath the rain across the street. Holding flowers. Brett. He lowered the phone slowly while staring through the studio windows at her. Zelda's heartbeat stumbled once. Not from love, from memory. And suddenly she realized the final test of healing had arrived. Rain shimmered beneath the Chicago streetlights while Brett Lawson stood across from Zelda's studio holding white roses that looked painfully out of place in his hands. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city noise faded into the background. Traffic, sirens, people rushing home beneath umbrellas. None of it mattered, because somehow, after everything, they were standing here again. Only this time, Zelda wasn't the woman who would destroy herself trying to be loved properly. Slowly, she hung up the phone and walked toward the studio entrance. Brett watched her through the glass with an expression she barely recognized anymore. Not arrogance, not confidence. Loss. Real loss. When Zelda finally opened the door, cold rain-scented air swept into the studio. Brett looked thinner. Tired. The expensive executive polish was gone now. No luxury watch. No perfectly rehearsed corporate smile. Just a man standing in emotional ruins holding flowers like they could undo history. I didn't know if you'd come outside, he admitted quietly. Zelda folded her arms lightly. What are you doing here, Brett? He glanced down at the roses. I know this is probably stupid. That's not an answer. Brett nodded slowly. You're right. Silence stretched between them. Then he looked around the studio carefully. The warm lighting, the sketches pinned across walls, the life she rebuilt without him. Pain flickered visibly across his face. This place feels like you, he said softly. The comment caught her off guard, because once upon a time Brett stopped noticing her entirely. Now suddenly he saw everything. Too late, always too late. You look happy, he added. Zelda considered the question honestly. Not happy all the time, not magically healed, but peaceful. And peace felt far more valuable than excitement ever had. I feel free, she answered quietly. That one hurt him. She saw it immediately. Brett swallowed hard before speaking again. I've replayed that night 1,000 times. The gala, the microphone, the destruction. Zelda looked away briefly. So have I. He laughed bitterly under his breath. I used to think losing my promotion was the worst thing that could happen to me, and now Brett's eyes found hers. Now I know losing you was. The old Zelda would have melted hearing that sentence, would have mistaken regret for transformation, but healing changes your emotional eyesight. Now she saw the difference between guilt and growth. They're not the same thing, she said softly. Brett frowned slightly. What? Missing me and respecting me aren't the same thing. Silence. Rain tapped softly against the windows beside them. For a moment, Brett looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he nodded. You're right. That surprised her. Brett stepped farther inside the studio slowly. I spent months blaming you after the gala, he admitted quietly. I told myself you ruined my life. Zelda remained silent. Then eventually, he exhaled shakily. I realized you only exposed the life I ruined myself. The honesty in his voice sounded raw, unpracticed. Maybe for the first time in years, Brett Lawson wasn't performing. I was horrible to you, he said softly. Zelda's chest tightened painfully, because hearing the truth after begging for it for years felt strangely empty. You were cruel, she corrected gently. Brett nodded immediately. Yes. No excuses, no gaslighting, no emotional manipulation, just truth. And somehow that hurt more than fighting ever did. I kept trying to understand when I changed, Brett admitted quietly. But I think the truth is, I liked who I became when people admired me. Zelda looked at him carefully. And I stopped being useful to that version of you. Brett closed his eyes briefly. You became the only person who saw me before all the success. The sadness in his voice felt genuine now, and instead of valuing that, he laughed bitterly. I started resenting it. That confession settled heavily between them, because deep down, Zelda already knew. Brett didn't fall in love with Victoria because she was better. He fell in love with the version of himself reflected back through ambition, status, and ego. Meanwhile, Zelda carried history, truth, vulnerability, and insecure people often punish the ones who know them too deeply. I'm sorry, Brett whispered. The words trembled slightly. I know it's not enough. I know I destroyed everything. But, Zelda... His voice cracked softly. I am so sorry. Tears burned her eyes unexpectedly. Not because she wanted him back, because part of her waited years to hear accountability spoken without excuses attached to it. I believe you mean it, she admitted quietly. Brett looked up hopefully. That tiny flicker of hope almost broke her heart, because she remembered loving him once with terrifying depth. She remembered building entire futures around his smile. She remembered wanting children with him, growing old with him, fighting for him, and now all they had left were apologies standing in empty spaces where trust used to live. Brett stepped closer carefully. I can change. Zelda looked at him for a very long time, then finally she spoke the truth that changed everything. I think you probably can. Brett blinked, but not for me anymore. Silence crashed through the studio, heavy, final. Brett's face crumpled slightly, not dramatically, just humanly. I love you, he whispered. And there it was. The sentence she once would have sacrificed herself to hear again, but timing matters. Love arriving after destruction feels different, softer, sadder. Zelda smiled through tears. I know. Brett stared at her in disbelief. That's it. What else is there to say I'm asking for another chance? Zelda's heart hurt hearing it, because some part of her would always mourn the marriage she thought she had. But healing teaches you something difficult. You can love someone deeply and still refuse to return to the version of yourself that survived them. I forgive you, she said softly. Hope flashed across Brett's face instantly, then she continued. But forgiveness isn't permission. The hope vanished. Zelda stepped closer now, close enough to see exhaustion carved beneath his eyes. I spent years begging for emotional scraps from someone I would have given the world to, she whispered. And the worst part? Tears slid down her cheeks quietly. I truly believe that was love. Brett looked devastated. It wasn't, Zelda said gently. Love doesn't require you to disappear to keep it. The studio fell silent except for rain. Finally, Brett lowered his head. I don't know who I am without all the success. Zelda understood that too, because she once didn't know who she was without being needed. Maybe heartbreak stripped both of them down to truth eventually. The difference was, only one of them rebuilt honestly. Brett slowly held out the white roses. Zelda stared at them for a moment, then smiled faintly. You should keep those. His hand lowered slowly, and somehow that tiny rejection hurt him more than anger ever could. Zelda walked him toward the studio entrance quietly. When she opened the door, cold night air rushed inside again. Brett paused before stepping out. Will you ever love someone else? Zelda thought about it honestly, then nodded. Yes. Pain flickered across his face instantly, but this time she said softly, I'll never love someone more than I love myself. The sentence settled into both of them permanently. Brett looked at her one final time, really looked at her. Not as a wife, not as support, not as emotional security, but as a woman he underestimated until she became impossible to control. Then slowly, he walked away into the rain. Zelda stood in the doorway watching him disappear beneath the Chicago lights. And surprisingly, she didn't feel revenge. She felt release. The studio behind her glowed warm and golden, her name on the door, her future waiting inside, her peace finally intact. For years, Zelda believed survival meant holding on tighter. But standing there alone, breathing freely for the first time in forever, she finally understood the truth. The moment she stopped begging to be loved, she became unstoppable. Sometimes the hardest part of heartbreak isn't losing another person. It's realizing how much of yourself you lost trying to keep them. Zelda's story was never just about betrayal, cheating, or revenge. It was about a woman who slowly abandoned her own voice to protect someone else's ego, until one day she finally understood that love without respect will always become a prison. So many people stay in painful relationships because they confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice. They believe enduring disrespect makes them strong. But real strength is knowing when to stop begging for the bare minimum. Real strength is choosing yourself even when your heart is still grieving. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destroying the person who hurt you. It's rebuilding yourself so completely that their absence no longer destroys you. Brett only realized Zelda's value after she stopped needing his approval. And that's the tragedy of selfish people. They often don't recognize genuine love until they lose access to it forever. But Zelda's true victory wasn't his downfall. It was her healing, her peace, her ability to walk away without hatred and finally see herself as worthy of healthy love boundaries and happiness. If this story touched you in any way, let it remind you of something important. Being kind does not mean being weak. You are allowed to leave environments that constantly make you feel small. You are allowed to outgrow people who only love you when you're sacrificing yourself for them. And no matter how broken you feel right now, you can rebuild a life that finally feels like your own. If you've ever experienced betrayal, emotional manipulation, or a relationship that made you lose yourself, share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling about healing self-worth, karma, and powerful new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.